Why was she still alive? The question hung in Selene's mind as rough hands shoved her forward, knees buckling against mud hardened by days of sun. Chains bit into her wrists. Her ribs screamed from blows that hadn't stopped since dawn. She had counted every hour by the rhythm of torment, every strike like punctuation in a cruel sentence she couldn't escape. The guards wanted her broken. They wanted silence where defiance had lived, and for 3 days they thought they were close. But she hadn't given them what they craved. Her breath came ragged, shallow, but her eyes, those still burned. They saw the hunger in her gaze and mistook it for weakness. Hunger for food, for water. But what she craved wasn't theirs to deny. It was something deeper. A hunger to breathe air that wasn't filtered through canvas hoods, to stretch arms not bound by iron, to remember she was more than what they shoved into the dirt. And so when the shift change came, when boots shuffled out and a fresh pair arrived with lazy laughter, Selene made her decision. The first guard leaned close, smirking. His words were foreign but tone carried across language. Mockery, arrogance, delight in her fall. He bent low enough that she could smell the coffee still clinging to his breath. That was when she moved. A sudden snap of chain against bone, an eruption of shock on his face as her wrist swung upward and shattered his jaw. He staggered, a cry stuck in his throat. Before his partner could react, Selene wrenched the man's rifle free and drove its butt into the other's chest. The air fled his lungs in a single broken grunt. Then chaos. Screams fractured the yard. Prisoners stirred in their cages, eyes widening as the air filled with shouts. Guards scrambled, weapons half raised, disbelief slowing their hands. And in that heartbeat of confusion, Selene's body remembered what her spirit had never forgotten. She was a pilot, a soldier, and she was not finished. The chain clattered against her wrists as she spun, dragging the rifle close, firing once, twice. The recoil ripped through her bruised arms, but the effect was instant. One guard fell. Another ducked, shouting for backup. Her breath tasted of blood and dirt. Her vision swam. Yet through it all, her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone steadier, someone who had lived her whole life for moments just like this. Minutes blurred into thunder and dust. And then, impossibly, her hands were on controls again, cold metal, levers, switches. The cockpit of a foreign machine loomed before her, enemy script scrawled across dials she couldn't read. But she didn't need to read. Instinct spoke a language older than any nation. The Hind's turbines roared. Rotors spun, slicing air into a storm that whipped across the camp. Guards screamed warnings, prisoners pressed against bars, and the sky itself seemed to shudder. Selene, chained, starved, beaten, had seized their war machine. The same machine meant to hunt her, now bent to her will. She pulled the collective, heart hammering in rhythm with the blades. The helicopter lurched upward, unsteady, monstrous, alive. And for a brief second, before fire, before loss, before everything still to come, she allowed herself a single thought, sharp as steel and cold as truth. They thought I was just a prisoner. The Hind lifted higher. Dust swallowed the yard below. Prisoners cried out in disbelief, and Selene became the storm. Hours earlier, she had believed her story might end in silence. The crash had come out of nowhere like death always did. One moment, sky stretched endless in blue, horizon steady beneath her Apache's nose. The next, a shriek of warning tore through the cockpit. A missile. No time to think. Her body moved faster than thought. Pedals countered, cyclic pulled. The machine groaned, coughing altitude in ragged gulps. Trees rose like teeth, the plateau a scar of rock and dust waiting to swallow them whole. Beside her, Aaron Creed fought against fate with fingers slick in blood, visor spiderwebbed with cracks. His eyes darted wild, but his voice still steady, clipped, the way soldiers talk when they're already standing in fire. "Stay with me," Selene told him, though her own chest felt like it might burst. "Keep your head down. I've got it." The ground surged. Metal screamed. And then the bird came down, not a landing, not even a crash, something between, something her muscles forced into control because refusing was not an option. The world stilled only when dust choked the silence. 3 heartbeats, just 3. Then pain returned, and so did sound. The tick of hot metal, the shallow rasp of Creed's breath. Selene shoved her restraints away, forcing her body out, cutting him free. Her hands pressed to his chest, slick with a life seeping too fast. She begged the air for more minutes, for a medic, for mercy. But wanting never altered reality. Creed's hand found hers, squeezed once, slackened. Grief came fast and merciless. It wanted to drown her, to swallow her whole. But grief in combat has no room to sprawl. It stands in the corner, watching, waiting. And Selene pushed it there with all the strength she had left. Because voices were coming. Boots, shouts, too many. She didn't run, she couldn't. The plateau was a bowl, and she already felt eyes on the rim. So she made the only choice left. She surrendered. The blows came hard, rifles in her back, chains around her wrists. A hood over her head, heat and cloth shrinking the world to darkness. They dragged her, shoved her to her knees, called her pilot with laughter sharp as glass. She answered with silence. Inside that silence she built maps out of sound. Rotor blades to the east, a truck clutch grinding to the south, a generator coughing every fourth beat. She turned the world into coordinates, the way she always had. When the hood came off, she memorized everything. Razor wire strung high, towers like spines, bunkers squatting low, barracks in cruel order. They paraded her like a trophy. Prisoners watched with hollow eyes. One in the corner stared at her too long. She filed it away. Names could wait, facts could not. Her cage was steel, a chain to the floor, a bucket in the corner, and across from her a man whispered psalms with lips cracked and dry. Selene didn't pray. She counted footsteps instead. A camp is a machine. Every cog can jam, and she intended to find the weakness. But not yet, not until the timing was hers. When interrogations came, she gave nothing but name, rank, number. The officer asked questions with a fisherman's patience. He struck her when answers failed to come. The pain cut deep, but not deeper than her silence. When nights came, so did guilt, Creed's laughter, Creed's final breath. She let it stab her, then pushed it down. Pain was ballast. She carried it to stay upright. She whispered to herself in the dark, not prayers, promises. You misjudged what you caught. Not loud, not for the guards, for the world. You didn't net a broken bird. You put bars around a storm. And as the heavy rotors of the Hind returned, settling near the pad with a growl that shook her bones, Selene closed her eyes. She traced every sound, every shadow, every chance. She wasn't finished. She would not be finished until they learned the truth. Sometimes the storm doesn't roar. Sometimes it waits. And when it comes, nothing survives unchanged. Why did silence feel heavier than chains? The cage was narrow, the floor cold. Every sound in the camp carried through the bars like a cruel reminder that the world outside still moved while she was trapped in iron. Selene sat with her knees drawn tight, forehead resting on her arms, eyes half closed. To the guards it looked like fatigue. To her it was focus. She listened, always listening. The camp had a heartbeat, boots in rhythm, keys jingling against a thigh at the same second every circuit. The cough of a generator that failed, caught, failed again. Whistles at odd intervals, each meant to reassure the men inside their towers that order remained. It was a lie. Order was never permanent. Order was always waiting to break. But to find the weak point, she needed patience, and patience demanded silence. Across from her, a man with a scar across his brow whispered fragments of scripture, lips cracked, voice hoarse. The words fell like pebbles into water. Selene didn't pray with him, but she didn't stop him either. Faith was another kind of rhythm, another anchor against the weight. When guards hauled her from the cage, the world shrank to interrogation rooms. Concrete walls, bare bulbs, men who mistook cruelty for power. They struck her. They pressed questions into her ears like knives, frequencies, codes, call signs. She gave them 3 truths only. Name, rank, number. Nothing more. The strikes hurt, yes. The hunger hurt worse. The thirst burned her throat raw. But worse than all of it was the voice that taunted from the corner of her mind, whispering she could end this, whispering that all she had to do was break. She ignored it. Instead, she built maps out of memory. The camp was a machine, and machines could be broken. At dusk, guilt returned. Always at dusk, when the light stretched long and honest across the dirt. Creed's laughter echoed in her head. So did the sound of his final breath, shallow and ragged against her palms. Her chest ached with it. She let the grief burn her, let it cut deep. And then when it threatened to drown her, she told it to sit in the corner. Grief would not command her, not yet. Because she had work. She tested the chain around her ankle. 2 links stretched slightly, as if a larger man had once fought the same fight and lost. She rubbed them raw with her thumb and forefinger until her skin blistered. The pain was a promise. There would be a day when iron failed. The second day in the cage was worse. Heat pressed heavy, diesel fumes clung to the air, sweat turned her flight suit stiff. She drank the tin of water they gave her, but it did little to silence the ache in her chest. Still she listened. Still she mapped. The officer with the clipboard never looked left when he passed the barracks. The guard who hummed off-key always tapped his rifle twice at the same corner. The wheel chock near the landing pad sat untouched, forgotten like so many safety things. Each detail was a bead. She threaded them into a string. The string would one day become a knife. But it wasn't enough, not yet. Because no escape is ever made alone. That truth revealed itself the third night, when a whisper slid across the dim like a blade in the dark. Pilot. She didn't move at first, didn't turn, only listened. The voice came from the man closer now, crouched against the bars. His whisper carried weight, the kind of voice used to giving orders once before captivity dulled it. Selene let the silence stretch before answering. Keep your voice, you'll need it. The man didn't argue. He only shifted, sitting back, but the word he had spoken lingered between them like a signal flare. Pilot, not prisoner, pilot. By morning, she knew he would try again. The guards dragged her to the yard at midday. Sunlight cut sharp angles across the camp, glinting off rifles and the thin wires of towers. The junior officer strutted toward her, grinning as though her bruises were his medals. "You're not special," he whispered, leaning close enough that she could smell his stale breath. "You're just another bundle we'll unwrap." Selene lifted her chin and let her gaze drift past him, toward the open sky above the pad. Blue, vast. A rotary shadow crossed it, and the sound of turbines rolled across the camp. The officer noticed her look and misread it. "That sound," he chuckled, patting her cheek like a pet. "That's what hunts men who run." Hunt me, she thought, keep believing it. The worst mistakes are always born of confidence. When they shoved her back into the cage, her shoulders burned, wrists torn raw. She slumped against the bars, letting the appearance of fatigue sell itself. The guard who had carried keys passed again. She matched her breathing to his footsteps. 1-2, pause, scratch at his ear. Again, again. Patterns were gifts. Tomorrow or the day after, the camp would open its throat in the same place it swallowed pride. She would be ready. That night, when the camp settled into its shallow rhythm, the man leaned close again. His whisper slid through the dark. "You flew Apache." Selene didn't answer at first. She only tilted her head enough that the flicker of her eyes caught his. He continued, "Sergeant Holt, recon team, captured 3 weeks ago. My men, what's left of them, they're looking to me." She let silence weigh between them, then answered, voice steady despite the thirst cracking it. "On foot you won't get far. You'll be hunted by dawn." His jaw tightened, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "You have a better idea." Selene let the pause stretch, then tilted her chin toward the pad where the Hind sat each night, its turbines cooling with a growl that shook her bones. "They bring one here daily, sloppy, barely guarded, that's your way out." Holt stared at her like she'd spoken madness. His disbelief was almost louder than his words. "That's not the kind of thing we do without certainty." Selene's answer was quiet, certain. "It's the only certainty you'll get." For a moment silence hung heavy. Then Holt leaned back against the bars, eyes distant. He didn't answer, but his silence wasn't dismissal anymore. It was calculation. Selene closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to see better. To trace the yard in her mind, the guard's steps, the shadows cast at twilight, each fragment a piece of the storm building inside her. She wasn't waiting for luck. Luck was for the desperate. She was waiting for precision. And when it came, it would be merciless. Because she wasn't planning an escape. She was planning to steal the sky back. What kind of man smiles when he thinks he has already won? The door slammed behind her, echoing like a verdict. Concrete walls closed in, bare and unkind. A single bulb buzzed overhead, its light too harsh, too intimate. Two guards flanked her, their grips heavy on her arms, forcing her into a chair bolted to the floor. Chains rattled as they locked her in. And then he appeared. Victor. Taller than the others, composed. A predator who no longer needed to bare his teeth to be feared. His calm carried its own weight like a stone pressing down on the room. His uniform was pressed, his hair precise, but it was his eyes that caught her. The eyes of a man who believed the world would bend to his patience. He circled her once, like a chess player contemplating the board. When he spoke, his voice was almost courteous. "You are no longer in the sky, Captain. You are in my house now. Here, obedience is inevitable." Selene said nothing. He tilted his head as though her silence were expected, even welcomed. He gestured to the guards. They obliged with fists and boots. Impact thudded against her ribs, her cheek, her shoulders. Pain flared, but Selene clung to her stillness. She counted the blows, their rhythm. The room was data, and she never stopped gathering. Leaned close enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath. "Every pilot breaks," he murmured. "You'll beg to share what you know. You'll trade secrets for water, for sleep, for less pain." Selene met his gaze. Her voice, when it came, was low, calm. "Name, rank, number." His faint smile tightened. The kind of smile a man wore when he thought patience itself was victory. He gestured again. More strikes, more pain. But Selene kept her silence locked tight behind clenched teeth. When they hauled her back to the cage, she carried not defeat but fire. The prisoners whispered as she was dragged past. Their eyes followed her, some hollow, some curious. Holt, especially. He studied her face, searching for cracks. That night, the sergeant leaned close again, his voice a rasp just above the hum of generators. "They'll break you if you let them." Selene didn't open her eyes. She sat with her back against the bars, head resting on her knees, voice soft but sharp. "They won't." Holt exhaled, a sound between disbelief and reluctant admiration. "You've still got fight. That's rare in here." "I don't fight to survive," she said. "I fight to finish." Silence stretched. Then Holt's whisper, "My men look to me, but I can see it now. They're watching you too." Selene's eyes opened then. The camp lay in shadows, guards packing lazily, searchlights slicing the dust. She spoke without looking at him. "Then don't waste that. Don't let them believe running is all we have left." Holt frowned, wary. "Running through the forest buys us a chance, a slim one, but a chance." "It buys you a grave," she countered. "You want freedom. Stop thinking like prey." He studied her in silence. The words weren't just defiance, they were a blueprint. The following day brought more cruelty. Guards shoved her into the yard again, displaying her like a prize. Prisoners watched, gaunt faces pressed to bars. The junior officer strutted, making a show of asking if she was sensible yet. When she repeated her identification, he laughed for the benefit of the crowd. But something in her refusal unsettled him. He leaned close, voice low and vile. "You're not special. You're just another body we'll unwrap when the time comes." Selene tilted her head, gaze drifting to the sky again. Blue, clean. The sound of rotors carried across the camp. The officer noticed, misread it, and chuckled. "That sound," he said, "that's what hunts men who run." Selene didn't answer. She didn't need to. Inside her chest, defiance coiled. When they shoved her back into the cage, Holt leaned against his bars. His whisper was urgent. "You've been watching that pad. Why?" Selene met his eyes. For the first time, her voice carried not just defiance but command. "Because that's not just a helicopter, it's the key. They bring it here every night, and one day soon I'm going to take it." Holt blinked. Disbelief warred with something else, hope, dangerous and fragile. "You're serious?" "Deadly." He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "You're out of your mind." But he didn't turn away, he didn't dismiss her, and in that she saw it, his resolve cracking, bending toward possibility. That night Selene lay against cold steel, eyes closed, tracing her map again. Every shadow, every sound, every weakness until the cage itself became a blueprint. She whispered only once, so quietly no one but the bars heard it. "They think I'm finished. Let them. The worst mistake is always the one made with confidence." The second dawn in captivity came sharp and cold. Diesel fumes clung to the compound, grain boiled into gruel that coated the air. Guards hauled her to the block again, but this time was waiting himself. He studied her silence as though it were a puzzle he intended to solve. His voice remained calm, deliberate. "You mistake defiance for strength, but strength runs out. You will learn obedience." Selene breath slow, name, rank, number. He smiled faintly, gesturing for another round of fists. Pain flared, but Selene didn't give him what he wanted. As they dragged her back, she fixed his face in her memory, not as fear, as a target. Back at the cages, Holt leaned close again. His whisper was taut low. "We're planning something, soon. Guard shift change, east perimeter weak. Overwhelmed 2 watchmen, break for the forest." Selene kept her gaze steady, voice flat. "You won't make it." His jaw tightened. "You have a better plan." She tilted her head toward the pad. "That Hind, that's our way out." His eyes searched hers, suspicion, hope, conflict. He shook his head again, but not in dismissal, only in struggle. "That's suicide." Selene's voice was calm, steady. "No, suicide is running into the trees and pretending they won't find you. Flying out is war on our terms." Holt stared, caught between disbelief and conviction. Silence stretched, thick as smoke. And then for the first time he nodded, not fully, not with certainty, but enough. Selene closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her bones. Yet inside her something had shifted. The camp believed it held her in chains. What it didn't see was that each day, each hour, every pattern and every weakness was feeding the storm. She wasn't just waiting to escape. She was waiting to strike. And when she did, it would not be for survival alone. It would be for Creed, whose laughter still haunted her. For the prisoners whose eyes followed her every step. For every insult and every bruise and every man who thought her silence meant surrender. The storm would break. And when it did, camp would never be the same. What if the chains were weaker than the will that wore them? The day dragged heavy. Heat baked the yard, pressing dust into hard crust beneath Selene's boots. She sat slouched in her cage, eyelids lowered, letting the guards see only exhaustion. But inside, her mind was taut wire, every sense listening, every thought coiled around a single truth. Tonight, the rhythm of the camp would falter. Across the aisle, Holt leaned against his bars, murmuring prayers under his breath. To the guards, it looked like ritual. To Selene, it was cover for the conversation they both knew was coming. "You're certain about this?" he whispered, lips barely moving. Selene didn't open her eyes. Her voice was steady, husky with thirst but sharp with certainty. "Running into the trees is a coffin already dug. This is the only way we make it out." Silence stretched, broken only by the jingle of keys as a guard ambled past. When he disappeared, Holt leaned forward. "I've got 12 men still fit to fight. Not strong, but willing. They've been waiting for me to give them hope. If I hand them to you and this fails—" Selene cut him off, her gaze lifting finally, steady as stone. "Then we die here instead of dying in the forest. At least this way, we die with a chance to fly." The words weighed heavy. Holt didn't answer right away, but something flickered across his face, an ember catching, reluctant but undeniable. By late afternoon, the sky bruised orange. Shadows stretched long, and with them, opportunity. Guards swapped shifts near the outer wall. Two lingered too long in conversation. Another barked at them from a tower. Distraction. The moment she had been waiting for. Selene rose in a fluid motion, wrists still bound but body coiled. She lunged toward the bars, chains snapping across the jaw of the nearest guard. The crack of bone rang sharp, rifle clattering from his grasp. Before anyone could react, she shoved the weapon through the bars, kicking it toward Holt. He snatched it up without hesitation. Shouts erupted. Boots thundered. Selene dragged the stunned guard against the cage, yanking his free with shackled hands. Pain tore at her wrists, but the lock yielded with a click that sang like freedom. She burst out. A shoulder to a chest, a grunt, a guard toppling backward, air crushed from his lungs. Holt was on him an instant later, rifle butt smashing into temple. Chaos split the compound wide open. Prisoners roared in their cages, some banging bars, others seizing whatever they could reach. Guards scrambled, torn between containing the riot and protecting themselves. Selene swung her chain like a whip, striking a third man across the temple. Blood sprayed, the body crumpling into dust. For one breath, time slowed. The clang of alarms, the rising storm of shouts, the confusion on soldiers' faces as they realized the fight was no longer theirs alone. Holt's voice rose above the din. "Move, get them out." His men surged, breaking cages, dragging captives to their feet. Hunger and weakness became rage. The compound erupted into a storm of bodies, desperation lending strength where despair had stolen it. Selene bent, scooping up a dropped pistol. Its weight was familiar, reassuring. She glanced toward the concrete pad. Even before her ears caught it, her bones felt it, the distant thrum of rotors. A hind inbound. Her pulse steadied. This was it. She met Holt's eyes across the yard. His face was smeared with blood, jaw tight. She lifted her chin toward the pad. "This is our moment, we take it." He swallowed, then nodded grimly. "Then we finish it." Together they surged toward the breach. Selene fired at floodlights, plunging the yard into chaos. Holt covered her flank, barking orders, steadying men who faltered. Appeared on the balcony of the command post. His face twisted from disbelief into rage. He shouted commands in his native tongue, gesturing wildly toward the landing zone. Selene caught his glare across the smoke. Cold acknowledgement passed between captor and captive. She didn't flinch. The gates buckled under sheer desperation. Prisoners shoved them wide, pouring through. A truck parked near the fuel shed became a shield, Selene diving behind it as bullets sparked against metal. She leaned out, firing back with precision, keeping pressure on guards scrambling to organize. Then the air trembled. The Hind dropped low, rotors hammering dust into choking clouds. Its silhouette loomed monstrous against the twilight. A predator descending into a trap. Selene crouched behind the truck, eyes narrowed against grit. Holt's men steadied themselves, some with rifles scavenged, others with sharpened scraps of wood. Fear and anticipation warred on their faces. Selene whispered, voice cold and certain. "We can't damage the cockpit, weapons free on anyone outside." Holt relayed the order, his tone iron. The prisoners shifted into position, forming a crescent around the pad. The Hind skid struck Earth with a thud. Rotor wash flattened weeds, stinging skin. Two crewmen leapt out, one stretching, the other fumbling with the fuel hose. They didn't notice the shadows closing until Selene rose from cover, pistol raised. Now! Gunfire cracked, precise. Holt dropped one with a shot to the thigh. Another prisoner tackled the second, wrenching him into dust. Guards on towers swung rifles down, but Selene was already firing. Bullets shattered a spotlight, plunging the pad into half-light and haze. Screams tore through the confusion as more prisoners surged, overwhelming defenders. Selene sprinted beneath the swirling blades, the downwash hammering her shoulders. Her hand grazed the fuselage, warm, alive. She climbed fast, forcing open the cabin door. The pilot spun, eyes wide, hand reaching for a sidearm. Selene slammed her forearm into his wrist, knocking the weapon free. She drove her knee into his chest, breath fleeing his lungs in a strangled gasp. Behind her, Holt's men dragged the co-pilot from his seat, binding him with torn restraints. Outside, the rest of the crew were pinned by prisoners too desperate to let go. Selene slid into the pilot's chair. The layout was foreign, Russian script scrawled across panels, but beneath the alien letters she saw the language of flight. Collective cyclic pedals. The machine spoke, and she understood. She breathed once steady, and began the sequence she'd rehearsed in her mind 100 times in the cage. Instinct and memory bridged every gap. Holt leaned in the doorway, shouting over the roar. "How long until we can move?" "Minutes, if everything runs clean." His grin was sharp, grim. "Then we'll buy you time." The camp erupted outside. Sirens shrieked. His voice barked over radios, but the momentum was gone. Guards, once confident, now scrambled in disarray at the sight of their own war machine under siege. Selene's hands danced across switches, coaxing turbines higher. Her father's words echoed in her skull. Flying is thinking in 3 dimensions, reading machines as if they breathe. The Hind trembled, rotors biting harder. Power surged back into her hands. For the first time since the crash, she felt the sky leaning toward her again. She looked at Holt, rifle braced in the doorway, prisoners forming a perimeter around their stolen bird. "Hold them," she called, voice carrying above the engines. "I'm taking us airborne." And as the skids tore free of the earth, dust swirling into a storm, the prison camp realized too late. What they thought was containment had just become the beginning of a war. What does freedom sound like when it first begins? To Selene, it was turbines screaming into life. It was rotors cutting the air in violent circles, dust spiraling upward like the world itself was being torn open. Inside the cockpit, every gauge rattled, every switch hummed. Her body, bruised and bloodied, felt suddenly alive again. The Hind trembled under her hands, heavy, unfamiliar, but alive. "Hold them," she shouted over the roar. Holt braced in the doorway, rifle raised, prisoners forming a ragged perimeter around their prize. Some carried rifles stolen in the riot, others only sticks, blades, or fists clenched tight. They weren't an army. They were survivors with nothing left to lose. Outside, chaos swallowed the compound. Sirens shrieked. Guards fired blindly into the smoke. Prisoners surged through broken gates. His voice barked from the command post balcony, fury cracking through his calm mask. Selene didn't look at him. She didn't have to. She could feel his rage across the yard. Instead, she focused on the machine beneath her. Unfamiliar panels. Russian script glaring back at her, but language didn't matter, principles mattered. Lift, thrust, drag, weight. Every machine obeyed the same physics. Her fingers moved with instinct, finding switches by their placement, not their words. Fuel pumps, hydraulics, turbine feed. The beast growled louder, vibration rattling the frame. She whispered to herself, not a prayer but a vow. "You're mine now." The skids groaned, pulling free of the dirt. The Hind lifted, wobbling, protesting under the sudden demand. But Selene coaxed it steady, her touch precise despite the adrenaline tearing through her veins. Dust boiled across the pad. Guards shielded their faces, blinded. Selene banked left, swinging the nose toward the heart of the compound. Through the canopy, she saw it all like a blueprint. Guard towers like fragile teeth, antennas stabbing upward, fuel tanks clustered in corners. She'd memorized these targets without ever leaving her cage. "Hold tight," she called over the intercom. "This isn't just escape, this is payback." Holt's grim smile in the doorway said it all. The first burst of cannon fire roared through the dusk. Splinters of wood and steel erupted from the nearest tower, guards diving for cover. The Hind bucked under recoil, but Selene held steady, eyes sharp, hands sure. The camp convulsed. Searchlights flickered, then died as rockets slammed into the communications mast. Fire bloomed, cables snapped like whips. Radios went mute. Orders vanished into static. Men scattered in blind panic. Selene swung left, strafing the barracks. Flame chased shadows through the wooden frames. Prisoners still in cages screamed, at first in fear, then in joy, as walls cracked under the storm. Holt's voice cut through the roar. "We've broken them, finish it." Selene's jaw tightened. Not yet, not enough. She dipped low, angling for the fuel depot. One squeeze of the trigger and the tanks erupted. A chain of fire raced along pipes, swallowing the far side of the compound in rolling inferno. The ground bucked, shock waves slamming against the fuselage. But Selene didn't flinch. Through the haze she caught sight of again. He stood rigid amid chaos, shouting into a dead radio, his empire crumbling around him. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, hers from above, his from ruin. She gave him nothing, no triumph, no rage, just certainty. Then she banked away, flames devouring the prison behind her. Inside the cabin, prisoners clung to bulkheads, eyes wide. Some wept openly. Others stared at Selene as though she were no longer flesh but something mythic. Holt steadied them with clipped words, but his gaze never left her. "You gutted the place," he shouted above the roar. "We're clear, let's head for the ridge." But Selene's eyes flicked to the thermal display flickering in front of her, an unfamiliar panel, yet instinct told her what it revealed. Amid the blaze, pockets of heat glowed where no fire should have been. Underground. Prisoners still alive. Her grip tightened on the collective. "Not yet." Holt blinked, disbelief cutting through his battle-hardened face. "What do you mean, not yet? We've got the bird. We've got our men. If we stay, they'll scramble more." "There are people still inside," Selene said, voice calm, cutting. "Buried them below. I saw the shadows on the display." Holt cursed, dragging a hand across his scalp. "That's suicide. You're pushing luck further than anyone should." Selene banked the Hind back toward the flames. "Luck didn't get us this far. Calculation did. You wanted certainty. There it is." The helicopter swept low over scorched earth, ash swirling like snow. Selene guided it to a stretch of dirt near the collapsed command post where fire hadn't yet touched. The skid slammed down hard. "Cover me," she barked. Before Holt could argue, she was out of the cockpit, boots pounding dirt, pistol raised. Prisoners followed instinctively, some armed, others barehanded. Smoke clung to their skin as they rushed a sunken concrete hatch half buried under rubble. Selene knelt, fingers finding the lock. She fired twice. Metal screamed, then split. Together they wrenched the hatch open. The stench of darkness exhaled. Voices rose, weak, desperate, alive. One by one, prisoners clawed their way into the light. Hollow eyes, gaunt faces. Men who had forgotten daylight. Selene and Holt's fighters dragged them free, pulling them toward the helicopter. Gunfire crackled from the far side of the yard. The last loyal guards had regrouped, shooting wildly. Holt returned fire, steady and merciless. Selene pulled the final captive through the hatch. She hurled a grenade down the stairwell, slamming the door shut as the explosion sealed the dungeon forever. Back to the Hind. They sprinted across ruin, weaving through fire and smoke. Selene climbed back into the cockpit, guiding new arrivals aboard. The helicopter groaned under the added weight, but she coaxed it skyward, rounds pinging off its fuselage. The Hind clawed into the evening air once more, rising over smoldering ruin. Inside, newly freed men sobbed. Others stared at Selene as though she had pulled them from death itself. Holt crouched near the doorway, rifle across his knees, sweat and soot streaking his face. His voice was raw, almost reverent. "You risked all of us for strangers." Selene kept her eyes forward. "I wasn't leaving anyone in his grave, not while I had the power to lift them out." The words hung heavy in the cabin, heavier than the rotors, heavier than the fire below. A vow unshakable. For the first time since capture, Selene wasn't just surviving. She was rescuing. She was avenging. She was rewriting the meaning of captivity itself. And the world below knew it. The prison was no longer a fortress. It was a graveyard lit by its own arrogance. But Selene didn't smile, didn't celebrate, because she knew still lived. And men like him never let humiliation stand unanswered. This was only the beginning. How long could freedom last before the hunt began? The Hind roared low across the valley, skimming treetops that bent beneath the storm of its rotors. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, gunpowder, and disbelief. Prisoners huddled against the bulkheads, some clutching each other, some whispering prayers in voices too weak to rise above the engine's scream. Selene gripped the controls like she was holding life itself. The machine bucked and swayed, heavy under the weight of 20 souls. Her jaw was tight, eyes flicking constantly between gauges and horizon. She wasn't just flying, she was calculating. Fuel low, ammunition half spent, airframe by bullets, hydraulics whining with every shift of collective. They had stolen freedom, yes, but freedom was fragile. And it would be hunted. "Where are we headed?" Holt shouted from the doorway, voice carried on rotor thunder. His face was drawn tight, the kind of calm that only comes when men are past fear. "North," Selene barked back. "Mountains cover." He nodded once, trusting her. Not because trust came easy, but because right now trust was all they had. The canyon opened before them, jagged walls of stone painted in dusk's fatting light. Selene dropped altitude, weaving between outcroppings, the Hind shuddering under her precision. The prisoners gasped with each dive, each sudden bank, but Selene barely noticed. Her world had shrunk to controls and instinct. Then it came, the sound. At first just a tremor in the distance, then a pulse in the air, familiar, hated. Rotor blades. Her blood went cold. She didn't need Holt to ask, she knew. Another Hind. Sound sent to tear the sky apart. The radio hissed to life, a voice thick with accent dripping venom. "You cannot run, Captain. You fly my machine, but you are still my prisoner." Selene's lips pressed tight. She didn't answer, not yet. The pursuing helicopter swept into view above the canyon rim, a silhouette against bruised clouds. Its nose dipped, cannon swiveling. "Hold on," Selene shouted. The first burst of gunfire chewed into rock beside them, shards spraying across the valley. Prisoners screamed, ducking instinctively. Holt braced himself, one arm hooking around a beam, rifle clutched in the other hand, though it was useless against the predator above. Selene yanked the cyclic, dragging the Hind into a dive so sharp the canyon floor blurred. Warning lights screamed. Metal groaned. The frame shuddered like it might tear apart. But the canyon saved them. Cliffs swallowed the enemy's line of fire, forcing him to reposition. Selene skimmed low, weaving between stone pillars, forcing pursuit into confines. Holt stumbled forward, gripping the cockpit frame. "Tell me you've done this before." Her eyes didn't leave the horizon, never in a Hind. His laugh was short, bitter. "Hell of a time to learn." The pursuing helicopter loomed again, shadows flickering across its fuselage. Missiles armed beneath its wings, a hunter settling for the kill. Selene's pulse slowed. She heard Creed's voice in her head, calm as always, reminding her, "Don't fight the bird, dance with it." She inhaled once, steady. Then she pulled the Hind into a climb, rising sharply until stone walls vanished into sky. The enemy followed. Cannon fire shredded the air, rounds sparking off their tail boom. The frame shook, alarms wailing. One prisoner cried out as shrapnel tore through the cabin wall, slicing his arm. Holt pressed him down, shouting for the others to stay low. Selene banked hard, flipping them sideways along the canyon rim. Gravity yanked at her, ribs screaming against bruises. The Hind howled in protest but obeyed. The enemy overshot, momentum carrying him wide. For a heartbeat, Selene had his flank exposed. She squeezed the trigger. The cannon thundered, rounds stitched across the enemy's fuselage, sparks and smoke flaring. But it wasn't enough. The Predator wobbled, then steadied, swinging back into pursuit. "Stubborn bastard," Holt growled. Selene's jaw clenched. Hadn't sent amateurs. This pilot knew the machine as well as she did. It was a duel now, machine against machine, instinct against instinct. Another missile lock alarm screamed. Selene shoved the cyclic forward, dropping them into the canyon again. Trees blurred inches from the skids. The missile streaked overhead, detonating harmlessly against the cliffs. She didn't flinch. Her mind mapped every bend, every shadow. She remembered training flights in canyons back home, the way instructors drilled them. Low flight isn't speed, it's precision. Every inch counts. Now every inch was survival. The canyon narrowed. Water glistened below, a river cutting silver through stone. Selene dropped lower still, skimming the surface, rotor wash spraying waves. The enemy hesitated, wary of the tight quarters. That hesitation bought seconds. Holt crawled closer, gripping her shoulder. His voice was hoarse but steady. "If you've got a miracle, now's the time." Selene's eyes flicked to the cliffs ahead. She saw it, an outcrop leaning sharp, jagged, with a narrow split just wide enough for a Hind. Or maybe too narrow. She set her jaw, "Hold on." The Hind screamed as she threw it into the split rock, blurring past both wingtips. Paint scraped. Sparks flew. Prisoners cried out, clinging to each other. The pursuing helicopter tried to follow. Too wide. Its rotor clipped the cliff. The machine spun, shrieking metal tearing sky apart. For a moment, it looked like it might recover. Then it cartwheeled into stone, erupting in a fireball that lit the canyon walls in orange fury. The shock wave slammed into Selene's Hind, tossing it sideways. Warning lights blazed. She wrestled the machine upright, muscles screaming. Then silence. The only sound was their own rotors, steady, defiant. The cabin erupted in cries, cheers, sobs, disbelief. Prisoners clutched each other, some laughing through tears. Holt slumped into the co-pilot's seat, chest heaving. His eyes found hers, raw with awe. "You just killed a Hind with a stolen Hind." Selene's hands trembled on the controls. She didn't let it show. "We're not safe yet, we'll send more." But inside, for the first time since Creed's last breath, a flicker of pride burned. Not triumph, not joy, something quieter. Proof. Proof that she could still fly. Proof that chains hadn't stolen who she was. The canyon opened into a wide basin, moonlight silvering the peaks. Selene angled the Hind north, into the mountains, into shadows deep enough to hide. For now they had space, for now they had breath. But she knew the truth. This wasn't the end of the storm. This was only its gathering. Why does victory feel so heavy when it finally comes? The Hind limped northward, engines straining, hydraulics whining like wounded animals. Selene sat rigid at the controls, her hands aching from the fight, her ribs sore where boots and fists had left their mark. The cockpit smelled of oil, smoke, and sweat. Behind her, silence pressed down. Not the silence of calm, but the silence of exhaustion. Prisoners, no, survivors, sat slumped along the walls, some clutching wounds, others simply staring into the dark as if afraid it would close in again. Holt moved among them, binding injuries with scraps of cloth, steadying men whose bodies shook with delayed terror. His voice was low, gruff, but there was something almost fatherly in the way he touched each shoulder, as if reminding them they were human again. Selene didn't look back. She couldn't, not yet. Because the machine needed all of her. Warning lights still blinked across the console. Fuel gauges sagged lower than she liked. Every tremor in the frame felt like a question she had no answer for. She guided them higher into mountain shadows where radar struggled, where night could shield them. The canyon fell away behind them, swallowed by smoke and ruin. For a brief moment, the sky felt wider. And yet her chest felt. Creed's voice rose again in memory, unbidden, sharp as glass. His laughter in the cockpit beside her, his last breath in her arms. She felt it all again, loss carving fresh lines through scars. Her knuckles whitened on the controls. She forced herself to breathe. Holt finally sank into the co-pilot's seat, sweat streaking dirt across his face. He studied her for a long moment, then said softly, "They're looking at you, you know, like you're the reason they're alive." Selene kept her eyes forward. "Don't let them. Hope built on one person is a fragile thing." Holt almost smiled. Almost. Maybe, but fragile hope is still more than none. The words stung, because she knew he was right. An hour passed in uneasy silence. The moon rose higher, painting jagged ridges in silver. The Hind's shadow crawled across peaks like a specter. At last, Selene spotted what she'd been searching for. A plateau hidden between two, flat enough to land, sheltered enough to hide. She brought the Hind down carefully, the skids kissing dirt with a groan. Engines whined down, rotors slowing. The sudden quiet was deafening. The survivors spilled out, some collapsing to their knees, others lying back to feel the cold earth against their skin. A few wept openly, unashamed. Selene climbed out last, boots crunching on stone. The mountain air was thin, sharp, tasting of pine and snow. She stood for a long moment beside the bird, hand resting on its battered fuselage as if anchoring herself. She should have felt triumph, but instead she felt hollow. Because freedom won in fire always comes at a cost, and she knew was still alive. That knowledge hung over her like a shadow too heavy to shake. Holt approached, arms crossed, eyes scanning the men huddled in small clusters. "They're worn down to nothing. Food, water, we'll need both before dawn." Selene nodded. "The Hind won't carry us forever. She's bleeding systems, but she'll hold long enough to get us out of the mountains. Assuming doesn't send half his army up here." Selene glanced at him, expression hard. "He will. Men like him don't swallow humiliation. They choke on it until it's avenged." Holt studied her face, then said quietly, "That's what scares me. You're not just running from him. You're already planning to face him again." Her silence was answer enough. Hours passed in fractured rest. Men huddled around small fires, whispering names of those they'd lost. Selene sat apart, cleaning a pistol with deliberate movements, her braid hanging loose, hair tangled with dust. Every scrape of cloth against metal steadied her hands but not her heart. She replayed every second of the escape, every prisoner freed, every guard killed, every risk taken. And beneath it all, Creed's face haunted her, a reminder of the price already paid. When Holt sat beside her, she didn't look up. "You don't sleep," he said quietly. "Not when I'm hunted." His voice lowered. "You're carrying something heavier than chains, guilt, maybe grief." She paused, cloth stilling in her hands. Her throat felt raw, words scraping like stone. "He trusted me, and I couldn't save him." Holt didn't argue, didn't offer comfort. He only sat with her in silence, which was more mercy than words could have been. The night grew colder, stars wheeled above them. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled. And then faintly, too faint for most to notice, it came. The thrum. Low, distant, familiar. Selene's head snapped up. She closed her eyes, listening. Not a wolf, not wind, rotors. Her eyes opened, sharp. "They're coming." Holt surged to his feet, barking orders. Prisoners scrambled, fire stamped out, weapons raised though they were few and frail. Selene ran back to the Hind, climbing into the cockpit. She flicked switches, coaxing turbines awake. The machine groaned, exhausted, but responded. Engines roared, rotors spinning back into fury. Lights appeared on the horizon, red, green, search beams cutting across mountain ridges. Hunt had begun. Selene's voice crackled through the cabin, steady, cold. "Strap in. This isn't over, not until we decide it is." The Hind lifted again, tearing into the night sky. And in her chest, amid fear and fury, a vow took root, unshakable, relentless. She hadn't stolen this bird to run forever. She had stolen it to end this. What happens when the hunted chooses not to run anymore? The Hind carved through night air, its rotors beating against thin mountain winds. Inside, silence gripped the survivors. Not fear this time, resolve. They knew pursuit was inevitable. They knew would not stop. And yet the bird held steady, as though its stolen heart pulsed with theirs. Selene sat in the cockpit, every nerve on edge. The gauges told a grim story, fuel dwindling, hydraulics strained, ammunition low. She didn't need Holt to remind her, they couldn't run forever. Her eyes swept the horizon. Cold stars blinked against black. Then, cutting across them, came the lights. 1, 2, 3. 3 Hinds in pursuit. Holt's voice was a low growl beside her. He sent the pack. Selene's jaw tightened. No, he came himself. She knew it before she saw it. The lead bird flew too precise, too deliberate. Wasn't a man who watched from behind walls. Not now. Not after being shamed before his own men. This wasn't just a hunt. This was vengeance. The radio crackled, his voice filling the cabin like poison. "You embarrassed me once, Captain. That was your last mistake." Selene didn't answer. She didn't give him the satisfaction of her voice. Instead, she banked low, weaving the Hind into the folds of the mountains. The prisoners groaned, some clutching at beams, others muttering prayers. Holt braced himself, calm despite the storm brewing behind them. "Tell me you've got a plan," he said. Selene's eyes flicked to the terrain ahead, ridges, valleys, jagged shadows. Her mind mapped them with ruthless clarity. "I'm not outrunning him," she said. "I'm ending him." Holt stared. "With what? You're down to scraps." Her voice was steady, almost cold. "Then I'll use the scraps. That's what he never understands. What looks broken can still fight." The enemy formation closed fast, engines snarling across the peaks. Tracers cut through the night, stitching fire across the sky. Selene rolled hard, rounds slicing where they had just been. The Hind shuddered, metal screaming, but held. She pulled them into a canyon, walls rising on either side. Her bird skimmed stone so close sparks showered the fuselage. Behind, followed, relentless. Cannon fire roared. Rocks shattered, avalanches spilling into the river below. Survivors screamed. Selene's breathing slowed, focus sharpening until time itself seemed to stretch. Every ridge, every shadow, every gust of wind, she saw them all as pieces on a board. Her hand tightened on the trigger. She swung the Hind sideways, letting the nose gun spit fire. Rounds slammed into the trailing helicopter, engines belching smoke before it spiraled into cliffs in a fireball. 2 left. pressed closer, his formation tightening. He wasn't cautious anymore. He wanted her blood. The second bird slid wide, missile lock screaming in Selene's cockpit. She dropped altitude fast, skimming river spray, the missile streaking overhead before detonating uselessly in the cliffs. The explosion rocked them, alarms shrieking. Selene yanked up, bringing her cannon around. Another burst, precise, brutal. The second helicopter reeled, tail boom snapping. It spun violently, then disappeared in a bloom of fire against the mountainside. One left. The canyon widened into an open basin, moonlight silvering jagged ridges. Selene climbed high, breaking free of the stone walls. Behind her, Hind followed, engines howling like a beast its kill. The radio hissed again, his voice sharp as a knife. You think you've won because you stole a machine. You are nothing without it. You are a prisoner playing pilot. Selene's eyes narrowed, her voice finally breaking the silence. No, I am what you couldn't break. She cut the transmission. The two Hinds danced in the night sky, predator against predator. Cannons spat fire, tracers crossing like lightning. Holt shouted bearings, prisoners clung to each other, the birds shaking with every recoil. Selene fought the machine like it was an extension of her body. Every bank, every climb, every dive, her defiance written in steel and smoke. Pressed harder, matching her move for move. He was skilled, ruthless. Their duel wasn't just survival, it was philosophy and fire. His belief that fear controlled all. Her belief that dignity lived even in chains. And then she saw it. A ridge ahead, sharp and narrow, splitting the basin in two. Wind whipped across it, unpredictable, deadly. Most pilots would avoid it. Selene aimed straight for it. Holt's eyes widened. You'll never clear that. Trust me, she cut in. The Hind screamed as she pulled every ounce of lift from its wounded frame. The ridge rose like a blade. Prisoners cried out, ducking instinctively. At the last heartbeat, Selene wrenched the cyclic, skids grazing stone as they soared over. Sparks showered, metal tearing, but they made it. Followed. But his pride betrayed him. He came in too fast, too certain. His rotor clipped the ridge, shattering in a spray of fire. For one terrible instant, his Hind hung broken against the sky, then it spun, tumbling into the abyss below. The explosion painted the mountains in orange light. Flames licked the night, echo rolling through valleys like thunder. Selene steadied her machine, chest heaving. The radio hissed one last time, a broken voice, ragged with fury. You will never silence me. Then static. And silence. The sky belonged to her again. She guided the Hind north, the mountains opening into endless night. Behind her, the survivors began to weep, not in despair but in release. Holt slumped into the co-pilot's seat, staring at her like he'd never seen anyone like her before. You didn't just escape, he said quietly. You rewrote what survival means. Selene kept her eyes on the horizon. Her voice was steady, soft. I didn't do it to survive. I did it because dignity doesn't beg. It doesn't bow, it doesn't break. The moon lit her face, bruised and but unyielding. The Hind carried them into shadowed freedom, engines fatting into the night. And in the stillness that followed, a truth remained, etched not in words but in the silence she carried with her. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.